Few stories in American criminal history are as unsettling as the tale of a man who managed to stand at the top of the underworld while secretly standing beside the very government sworn to destroy it, and that man was James Whitey Bulger, a figure whose life forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality that power, secrecy, and ambition can blur the line between justice and corruption in ways that shake public trust to its core. Born in 1929 in a working-class neighborhood of South Boston, Bulger grew up in an environment shaped by hardship, tight-knit loyalty, and a fierce sense of territorial identity that would later define his criminal empire. South Boston during his youth was a place where reputation meant survival, where community ties were strong but opportunities were limited, and where young men often found themselves pulled toward street life as a path to recognition and financial gain. Bulger was no exception. As a teenager, he drifted into petty crime, engaging in theft and small-time scams that eventually escalated into more serious offenses. His early brushes with the law culminated in federal prison sentences for bank robbery in the 1950s, a period that exposed him to hardened criminals and solidified his reputation as someone unafraid of risk. Prison did not reform him. Instead, it refined him. Behind bars, he absorbed lessons about hierarchy, silence, and the strategic use of fear. When he returned to Boston, he did not come back as a reckless youth, but as a calculating figure, determined to carve out a lasting place in the city's criminal landscape. By the 1970s, Boston's underworld was divided among competing factions, including the Italian-American mafia families and various Irish-American gangs. Bulger aligned himself with the Winter Hill Gang, an Irish mob organization that controlled gambling, loan sharking, and extortion operations across the region. Through a combination of intelligence, ruthlessness, and an uncanny ability to read people's weaknesses, he rose steadily within the ranks. Unlike flamboyant crime bosses who courted publicity, Bulger cultivated a quieter menace. He rarely sought attention, preferring instead to build an aura of unpredictability that kept both allies and enemies on edge. Those who crossed him were dealt with swiftly, and the message traveled fast through the streets of Boston. Loyalty to Bulger meant protection and profit. Betrayal meant consequences that could be fatal. What made his ascent even more extraordinary, however, was not simply his criminal success, but the secret alliance forming behind the scenes. During the 1970s, the Federal Bureau of Investigation was intensely focused on dismantling the Italian mafia's grip on organized crime. To achieve this, agents sought informants within rival groups who could provide intelligence on La Cosa Nostra. Bulger, through a complex chain of introductions and negotiations, became one of those informants. Officially registered under a confidential status, he began supplying information about mafia figures while continuing to expand his own criminal operations. This arrangement created a paradox that would later ignite one of the most controversial scandals in federal law enforcement history. On paper, Bulger was assisting the government in its war against organized crime. In reality, he was leveraging his informant status as a shield, using inside knowledge to eliminate competitors and strengthen his hold over Boston's underworld. The relationship between Bulger and certain FBI agents evolved into something far more problematic than a standard informant-handler dynamic. Reports and later investigations suggested that some agents developed personal loyalties that compromised their objectivity. Instead of strictly managing him as a source, they allegedly warned him about pending indictments and investigations, allowing him to stay steps ahead of prosecutors and rival gangs alike. This protected position enabled Bulger to consolidate power in ways that would have been impossible under normal scrutiny. As Italian mafia leaders were targeted and dismantled through federal cases, Bulger's organization flourished, stepping into territories once dominated by others. His empire expanded into drug trafficking, illegal gambling, extortion, and money laundering, generating substantial profits while reinforcing his image as an untouchable force. Within South Boston, he cultivated a dual identity. To some residents, he was a local figure who contributed to neighborhood causes, handed out small favors, and maintained a certain code that appeared to spare civilians from random harm. To others, particularly those who had witnessed or suffered from his violence, he was a calculating predator who ruled through intimidation. The duality mirrored his broader double life. To federal agents in select offices, he was a valuable asset in the fight against organized crime. To victims and rivals, he was a ruthless mob boss. The secrecy surrounding his informant status was so tightly guarded that even many within law enforcement were unaware of the protection he allegedly enjoyed. This compartmentalization allowed the arrangement to persist for years, creating an environment in which accountability was blurred and ethical lines were repeatedly crossed. As Bulger's influence grew, so did the list of allegations tied to his organization. Associates were linked to acts of violence that removed obstacles and silenced dissent. Witnesses were intimidated. Rumors circulated about bodies disappearing and cases collapsing. Yet prosecutions against Bulger himself seemed to stall or evaporate, reinforcing the perception that he possessed powerful allies. His strategic brilliance lay not only in his capacity for intimidation, but in his understanding of institutional weaknesses. By feeding selective information to the FBI, he ensured that attention remained focused elsewhere, particularly on Italian mafia leaders, whom federal authorities viewed as primary targets. In this way, he positioned himself as indispensable. Removing him would have meant sacrificing a source considered critical to broader investigations. That dependency, whether fully acknowledged at the time or not, granted him extraordinary leverage. The moral dilemma at the heart of this story becomes clearer when examining the broader context of law enforcement strategies during that era. The fight against organized crime often relied heavily on informants, individuals who were themselves deeply involved in criminal activity, but who could provide insider intelligence that traditional surveillance could not. The practice required a delicate balance, protecting the source enough to maintain cooperation, while preventing the source from committing further crimes under the government's watch. In Bulger's case, critics later argued that this balance was catastrophically mishandled. Instead of containing his activities, the relationship allegedly enabled them. Each successful mafia prosecution strengthened the perception that the strategy was working, even as Bulger's own operations thrived in the shadows. Meanwhile, his personal mythology expanded. Stories circulated about his temper, his strategic mind, and his ability to predict moves before they happened. Associates described a man who demanded absolute loyalty and who maintained control through both calculated generosity and sudden cruelty. He understood the psychology of fear, ensuring that no one doubted the cost of betrayal. Yet he also understood optics. Maintaining a low profile helped him avoid unnecessary attention. He rarely flaunted wealth publicly, preferring discretion over spectacle. This restraint made him less visible than other crime figures who attracted headlines with lavish lifestyles. It also aligned conveniently with the FBI's interest in keeping their informant's identity concealed. Over time, however, cracks began to appear. Rumors of corruption within federal ranks surfaced, and defense attorneys in various cases questioned how certain suspects consistently evaded charges while rivals fell. Journalists started probing inconsistencies in prosecution patterns. Families of victims demanded answers about stalled investigations. The notion that a major crime boss could operate for years with minimal interference began to raise serious questions about systemic failure. Bulger's story, at this stage, was no longer just about organized crime. It was about institutional vulnerability. How could the machinery of federal law enforcement, equipped with vast resources and legal authority, allow such a figure to operate unchecked? The answer, as later investigations would suggest, lay in a complex web of secrecy, misplaced trust, and an overriding objective to dismantle one criminal network at the expense of overlooking another. For Bulger, the arrangement was a masterstroke. He had positioned himself as both predator and protected source, manipulating rival gangs while benefiting from insider knowledge that kept him insulated from immediate consequences. The longer the relationship continued, the more entrenched it became, making it increasingly difficult for anyone within the system to challenge it without exposing their own complicity or negligence. Thus, throughout the late 1970s and 1980s, Bulger's power appeared to grow almost unchecked. He remained a dominant figure in Boston's criminal ecosystem, balancing brutality with calculated alliances and always staying informed about potential threats from law enforcement. His life during this period reflects a chilling study in dual identity. A man feared on the streets, quietly cooperating with federal agents and maneuvering through both worlds with strategic precision. The public, unaware of the full picture, saw only fragments of the truth. Beneath those fragments lay a deeply flawed partnership that would eventually unravel, but for years it functioned as a hidden engine, powering one of the most controversial chapters in modern American criminal history, setting the stage for a reckoning that would expose not only the actions of a mob boss, but the vulnerabilities of the very institutions designed to stop him. As the 1980s progressed, the carefully constructed balance that had allowed James Whitey Bulger to thrive in both the criminal underworld and within the confidential files of federal law enforcement grew increasingly unstable. Yet for a time it appeared as though his strategy was not only sustainable, but remarkably effective. His organization tightened its grip over South Boston and extended its reach into surrounding areas, consolidating control over illegal gambling rings, loan sharking operations, and racketeering schemes that generated steady streams of revenue. Competitors who resisted found themselves isolated, discredited, or removed entirely from the landscape, and the message was unmistakable. Cooperation with Bulger meant survival, defiance meant risk. At the same time, federal investigators continued their broader campaign against Italian mafia figures, achieving significant indictments that were celebrated publicly as major victories in the fight against organized crime. Within this narrative of success, Bulger's role as a confidential informant remained hidden from the public and even from many within the justice system, shielded by layers of classification and internal secrecy. The irony was profound. While prosecutors stood before cameras announcing breakthroughs against one criminal network, another network, led by a man providing selective intelligence, was entrenching itself more deeply into the city's illicit economy. The arrangement depended heavily on a small circle of handlers who believed that the intelligence Bulger supplied justified the risks associated with maintaining him as a source. Over time, however, allegations surfaced that the relationship had crossed ethical boundaries. Instead of merely receiving information, certain agents were accused of developing personal connections that clouded professional judgment. Critics later argued that this dynamic created an environment where warnings were allegedly passed along, investigations were slowed, and potentially damaging intelligence about Bulger himself was minimized or ignored. Whether through active misconduct or passive negligence, the effect was the same. Bulger appeared insulated from consequences that would have dismantled other criminal leaders. His confidence grew accordingly. Associates recalled that he seemed unusually well informed about law enforcement movements, often anticipating raids or indictments before they occurred. This foresight reinforced his aura of near omniscience within the underworld, strengthening loyalty among followers who believed they were aligned with a leader protected by forces beyond their understanding. Meanwhile, victims of his organization's activities struggled to see accountability. Families affected by violence and extortion encountered a system that seemed slow to act, and defense attorneys representing other defendants began scrutinizing the apparent disparity in enforcement. Journalistic investigations gradually intensified, probing patterns that suggested selective prosecution. Questions emerged about why certain figures were repeatedly targeted, while Bulger remained conspicuously absent from major indictments. These inquiries gained traction in the early 1990s, when internal reviews and court proceedings began to reveal fragments of the concealed relationship between Bulger and elements of the FBI. The exposure did not happen overnight. It unfolded through testimony, leaked documents, and persistent reporting that chipped away at the wall of secrecy. When the extent of the informant arrangement started to surface, it sent shockwaves through Boston and beyond. The revelation that a powerful crime boss had allegedly operated under the protection of federal agents challenged deeply held assumptions about the integrity of law enforcement institutions. Public trust, once shaken, proved difficult to restore. For years, the strategy of using informants had been defended as a necessary tool in dismantling complex criminal enterprises. Now, the question was whether that tool had been misused in a way that enabled further harm. Bulger himself, sensing that scrutiny was intensifying, faced a turning point. In 1994, as indictments loomed and internal investigations closed in, he fled Boston, beginning a period of life on the run that would last more than 16 years. His disappearance added another layer of controversy. Critics argued that he had been tipped off about the pending charges, allowing him to escape just ahead of arrest. Whether through direct warning or through a pattern of intelligence that made his departure timely, the result was clear. One of the nation's most wanted fugitives had slipped away, deepening suspicions about the depth of institutional failure. As Bulger vanished, the focus shifted toward unraveling how such an extraordinary situation had been allowed to develop. Congressional hearings, internal Justice Department reviews, and high-profile trials examined the conduct of specific agents and supervisors. Some were convicted of corruption-related charges, while others faced disciplinary action or public censure. The proceedings painted a complex picture in which ambition, rivalry between agencies, and the pressure to deliver high-profile convictions created incentives that distorted ethical boundaries. Within the FBI, reforms were proposed to tighten oversight of confidential informants, clarify documentation requirements, and reinforce accountability mechanisms designed to prevent similar abuses. The scandal did not simply tarnish reputations, it prompted structural changes aimed at rebuilding credibility. Yet for the communities directly affected by Bulger's reign, reforms offered limited comfort. The sense that justice had been delayed, and in some cases denied, lingered. During his years as a fugitive, Bulger remained a symbol of unfinished business. His name circulated on the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives list, and periodic tips suggested possible sightings across the United States and abroad. The search consumed resources and became a long-running narrative in American crime reporting. Meanwhile, civil lawsuits filed by victims' families sought compensation and acknowledgement of wrongdoing, further exposing details about the informant relationship. Courtrooms became arenas where painful histories were revisited and where official records were scrutinized line by line. Through these proceedings, a clearer portrait emerged of how secrecy, compartmentalization, and personal loyalty had intersected in ways that undermined institutional safeguards. The broader implications extended beyond one city or one agency. The Bulger saga forced policymakers and legal scholars to reconsider the ethical calculus of informant management. Informants are, by definition, individuals involved in criminal conduct. Leveraging their insider knowledge requires granting them some measure of protection. The central challenge lies in preventing that protection from evolving into impunity. In Bulger's case, the perception, supported by later findings, was that the balance had tilted too far. Intelligence gains against one criminal faction had been prioritized over curbing another, creating a moral hazard that allowed violence and corruption to persist. As years passed without his capture, the mythos surrounding Bulger only grew. Some portrayed him as a cunning strategist who had outmaneuvered the system. Others viewed him as the beneficiary of systemic breakdown rather than personal brilliance. The truth likely contained elements of both. He demonstrated a keen understanding of power dynamics, but he also operated within an environment where institutional incentives and personal relationships created opportunities for exploitation. By the early 2000s, advancements in media dissemination and public engagement strategies introduced new approaches to tracking fugitives. Authorities released age-progressed images and increased publicity efforts, hoping to generate leads. Finally, in 2011, after more than a decade and a half in hiding, Bulger was arrested in Santa Monica, California. The capture marked the end of his life on the run and the beginning of a legal process that would once again place his history under intense scrutiny. His trial revisited decades of allegations, detailing charges that included racketeering and involvement in multiple acts of violence. Prosecutors presented a narrative of a crime boss who had exploited a corrupt relationship to build and sustain a powerful enterprise. Defense attorneys sought to challenge aspects of that portrayal, but the broader story had already reshaped public perception. When the verdict was delivered, it represented not only a judgment against an individual, but a symbolic reckoning with a troubled chapter in law enforcement history. Yet even with his conviction, debates persisted about accountability at higher levels. Critics questioned whether reforms had gone far enough, whether cultural changes within agencies had truly taken root, and whether safeguards were sufficient to prevent future abuses. The Bulger case became a reference point in discussions about transparency, oversight, and the risks inherent in confidential informant programs. Law schools analyzed it as a case study in ethical decision-making under pressure. Journalists continued to examine documents and testimony, seeking to understand how warning signs had been overlooked for so long. For Boston, the legacy was particularly complex. The city had endured years of violence and suspicion, and the revelation of federal misconduct compounded wounds that were already deep. Trust between communities and law enforcement required rebuilding through sustained effort rather than rhetoric alone. In reflecting on this period, it becomes clear that Bulger's power was never solely about physical force or street-level intimidation. It was about information: who possessed it, who controlled it, and how it was used. His ability to navigate two worlds depended on mastering that currency. By providing intelligence selectively, he shaped investigative priorities. By allegedly receiving insights in return, he neutralized threats before they materialized. The interplay between secrecy and authority created a feedback loop that magnified his influence. Ultimately, the unraveling of this arrangement underscores a fundamental lesson. When oversight mechanisms fail and personal loyalties override institutional principles, even well-intentioned strategies can produce damaging consequences. The second act of this saga, marked by exposure, flight, and eventual capture, reveals not just the downfall of a crime boss, but the vulnerability of systems that depend on trust, transparency, and disciplined adherence to ethical standards. Beneath those fragments lay a deeply flawed partnership that would eventually unravel, but for years it functioned as a hidden engine, powering one of the most controversial chapters in modern American criminal history, setting the stage for a reckoning that would expose not only the actions of a mob boss, but the vulnerabilities of the very institutions designed to stop him. By the time James Whitey Bulger stood trial, the man who had once seemed untouchable was no longer a shadow operating between alleyways and federal offices, but a frail, aging figure seated in a courtroom, confronted not only by prosecutors, but by decades of accumulated history that could no longer be buried beneath layers of secrecy. The trial became more than a legal proceeding. It was a public reckoning with a narrative that had stretched across generations, exposing uncomfortable truths about power, manipulation, and institutional failure. Prosecutors laid out a sweeping case that described a criminal enterprise sustained through intimidation, racketeering, and calculated violence, while also detailing the unprecedented protection Bulger had allegedly received due to his status as a confidential informant. The courtroom heard testimony about the structure of his organization, the methods used to enforce loyalty, and the climate of fear that permeated parts of Boston during his reign. Yet beyond the criminal charges themselves, the deeper theme was betrayal. Betrayal of community trust, betrayal of justice, and betrayal within the very agency tasked with upholding the law. As evidence unfolded, it reinforced a sobering realization. The same mechanisms designed to dismantle organized crime had, in this instance, been manipulated in ways that prolonged it. When the jury ultimately delivered its verdict, convicting Bulger on numerous counts, it signaled a measure of accountability, but it did not erase the broader consequences of the saga. Sentenced to life in federal prison, he was removed from the streets he once dominated, yet questions about how his empire flourished for so long continued to resonate. His imprisonment marked the end of his operational power, but not the end of the debate surrounding his legacy. In 2018, his life concluded violently within the prison system, an abrupt and brutal end that added another chapter to an already turbulent story. Even in death, Bulger remained a symbol of unresolved tensions between criminal enterprise and federal oversight. The arc of his life, from South Boston youth to feared gang leader, from informant to fugitive, from courtroom defendant to inmate, illustrates how systems can be distorted when ambition and secrecy converge without sufficient checks. For scholars, policymakers, and citizens alike, the enduring significance of his story lies not only in the crimes themselves, but in the structural vulnerabilities they revealed. Confidential informants remain a crucial tool in modern law enforcement, particularly in combating complex networks that are otherwise difficult to penetrate. However, The lessons drawn from Bulger's case emphasize the necessity of rigorous documentation, independent supervision, and ethical clarity, allowing a source to operate with minimal scrutiny, particularly when that source holds significant power, creates fertile ground for abuse. The reforms that followed the exposure of misconduct included tighter guidelines on informant registration, enhanced review processes, and clearer chains of accountability. These measures were designed to prevent personal relationships from overriding professional obligations and to ensure that intelligence gathering does not devolve into implicit endorsement of ongoing criminal activity. Yet reforms on paper must be sustained by culture in practice. Institutional change requires more than policy updates. It demands a commitment to transparency and an environment where concerns can be raised without fear of reprisal. Bulger's ability to manipulate relationships stemmed in part from a culture that prized results, namely, high-profile convictions against targeted groups, sometimes above balanced evaluation of collateral risks. The drive to dismantle one criminal organization overshadowed the growing strength of another, illustrating how strategic focus can inadvertently create blind spots. For the people of Boston, the story left a complicated imprint. Some who had once viewed Bulger as a neighborhood figure providing occasional favors confronted the darker realities presented in court. Others, who had long feared his influence, saw validation in the public acknowledgement of wrongdoing. The exposure of federal misconduct, however, also fostered skepticism toward institutions meant to protect the community. Rebuilding that trust required sustained dialogue, oversight, and visible accountability. Over time, the narrative shifted from fascination with a notorious crime boss to reflection on systemic resilience. Documentaries, books, and investigative reports revisited the saga, not merely to recount dramatic episodes, but to examine structural lessons. The case became a cautionary tale taught in criminal justice programs, underscoring the importance of ethical boundaries and the dangers of over-reliance on a single source. It also highlighted the complexity of moral compromise in law enforcement strategy. Informants often inhabit gray zones, and agencies must navigate those ambiguities carefully. The Bulger affair demonstrated what can happen when that navigation falters. His story compels a broader examination of power dynamics. Organized crime thrives on loyalty, fear, and control of information. Federal agencies rely on procedure, oversight, and lawful authority. When these two worlds intersect through confidential relationships, the potential for distortion increases. Bulger mastered the art of selective disclosure, offering enough intelligence to remain valuable while allegedly shielding his own operations from scrutiny. This selective transparency allowed him to influence the direction of investigations, subtly steering attention toward rivals and away from himself. The phenomenon underscores a paradox inherent in informant use. The more valuable a source becomes, the more leverage that source gains. Without vigilant oversight, leverage can transform into undue influence. In the years following his conviction and death, policy discussions continued to reference his case as a benchmark for reform. Agencies reviewed internal training programs, emphasizing ethical decision-making and the importance of documenting interactions with sources. External oversight bodies strengthened audit mechanisms to ensure that informant files were periodically evaluated by independent supervisors. While no system can eliminate risk entirely, the objective has been to minimize opportunities for personal allegiance or strategic tunnel vision to undermine justice. The enduring lesson is not that informant programs are inherently flawed, but that they demand constant vigilance. Transparency, within the bounds of operational necessity, serves as a safeguard against the kind of secrecy that once shielded Bulger's activities. His life story also raises philosophical questions about accountability and redemption. Despite years of alleged criminal dominance and eventual conviction, the broader harm inflicted on communities could never be fully reversed. Families affected by violence carried their losses forward, and institutional reputations required long-term effort to repair. Accountability, in this context, was partial and delayed. The passage of time did not diminish the gravity of earlier failures, but it did provide space for reflection and structural improvement. The arc of this saga ultimately illustrates how unchecked authority, whether wielded by criminals or by officials, can corrode trust. Bulger's manipulation of dual identities thrived in darkness. Exposure brought clarity, albeit belatedly. As society continues to confront organized crime and corruption, his story stands as a reminder that ends do not justify means when oversight falters. Power must be balanced by transparency, and strategy must be tempered by ethical discipline. The image of a mob boss who secretly operated as an informant captures public imagination because it embodies contradiction. Yet beyond the intrigue lies a sober message about institutional integrity. Law enforcement agencies operate with immense responsibility, and even isolated breaches can reverberate widely. The reforms sparked by this scandal demonstrate the capacity for systems to adapt, but they also underscore the cost of complacency. In reflecting on the full sweep of James Whitey Bulger's life, one sees a narrative defined by ambition, manipulation, and eventual reckoning. His rise was facilitated by environment and opportunity. His longevity was extended by secrecy and flawed oversight. His downfall emerged when transparency pierced the protective veil. The final chapter of his story does not offer neat resolution, but it does provide clarity about the stakes involved. When authority and criminality intersect, the legacy he leaves behind is less about notoriety and more about vigilance, a reminder that institutions must guard against the seductive simplicity of short-term victories achieved through morally compromised alliances. As viewers and citizens consider this complex history, the question is not merely how one man sustained such influence, but how systems can strengthen themselves to ensure that such contradictions do not persist unchecked. The intersection of organized crime and federal enforcement revealed by his case will continue to inform debates about accountability for years to come, serving as both warning and guide. If you are benefiting from our topics, please subscribe, like, and turn on the bell notification so you can see our new videos early.